The old community center always smelled the same. It was a mix of stale coffee from the pot that was never quite empty, the faint chemical scent of the floor wax that the janitor used every night, and the warm, slightly dusty air that seemed to get trapped in the old building's walls. For most people, it was just the smell of the place. For her, it was the smell of purpose. She arrived every morning at exactly 8:30, not with a grand entrance, but like a soft breeze that barely rustles the curtains. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the linoleum floors. She was a woman in her late 70s, though the years had etched themselves onto her face not with harsh lines, but with a gentle map of quiet living. Her silver hair was always pinned in a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and she wore the same kind of cardigan every day, no matter the weather-worn, buttoned up, and in a muted shade of gray or blue. She never introduced herself. And after so many years, no one thought to ask. To the staff, she was simply the volunteer. To the young mothers who came for the toddler playgroups, she was a piece of the furniture, like the mismatched chairs or the faded posters on the wall. To the teenagers who sprawled across the couches in the afternoon, she was invisible, a gray blur they would navigate around without ever really seeing. Her days were stitched together with small, quiet rituals. First, she would wipe down all the tables in the main hall with a damp cloth, her movements slow and methodical. Then she would go to the small kitchenette and start a fresh pot of coffee, making sure it was ready for the 9 o'clock rush of staff and early bird visitors. She knew exactly how much coffee to use, how to fill the water tank so it wouldn't gurgle too loudly and disturb the peace. It was her silent gift to the center dot. After her morning rounds, she would find a small task that needed doing. Maybe a bookshelf needed dusting or a box of donated clothes needed sorting. She never waited to be asked. She just saw what needed to be done and did it, melting into the background once the task was complete. She ate her small lunch, a sandwich and an apple she brought from home, sitting alone at a corner table, watching the life of the center swirl around her. She saw the laughter, the arguments, the quiet moments of connection, but she was never a part of them. She was an observer, a silent guardian of this small, bustling world, but there was one place in the entire center that held a different kind of gravity for her. It was in the far corner of the main hall, tucked away behind a few forgotten potted plants. It was an old upright piano. Its wood was scuffed and chipped in places, and one of its legs was propped up with a folded piece of cardboard to stop it from wobbling. The keys were yellowed with age, some of them bearing tiny hairline cracks like the wrinkles on an old person's face. It hadn't been tuned in years, and most people who tried to play it just produced a mess of sour, discordant notes. It had become a kind of joke, a place for people to rest their coats or their coffee cups. She never played it. Not once in all the years she had been coming here. But she was drawn to it. Every day, usually in the late afternoon when the crowds had thinned and the sun cast long, golden rectangles across the floor, she would find herself standing before it. She wouldn't touch it at first. She would just stand there, her hands clasped in front of her, looking at it as if it were a sleeping old friend. Sometimes a faint, faraway look would come into her eyes, a memory flickering behind them so quickly that no one would have noticed even if they had been watching on this particular afternoon. The center was quieter than usual. A group of older ladies were knitting in another room, their soft chatter a distant murmur. The director, a kind but busy man named David, had given her a quick nod and a "thanks for all your help today" before disappearing into his office with a stack of papers. She was alone with the piano. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air around it. Making it look almost magical, she took a step closer, her scuffed shoes making no sound on the floor. Her eyes traced the familiar curves of the piano's body. She saw the water stain on the top, a dark ring left by a forgotten cup. She saw the initials LM carved into the side, a relic from some long-ago teenager. It was a neglected, unloved thing, and she felt a pang of something deep in her chest, a mix of pity and a strange, profound connection. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, she raised her right hand. Her fingers were thin and wrinkled, the knuckles a bit swollen from age. They were the hands of a woman who had spent her life doing quiet, practical things. But as her hand hovered over the keyboard, there was a change in them. A stillness, a poised grace that seemed entirely out of place. She didn't press down on any of the keys. Instead, her index finger, trembling just slightly, traced the outline of the ivory keys. It was a feather-light touch, a caress. She moved her finger from one end of the keyboard to the other, not playing a single note, but somehow, in the silence, you could almost hear a melody. It was a ghost of a song, a memory of music that lived in her fingertips. Her eyes closed. For just a moment, the scuffed, dusty community hall faded away. In her mind's eye, she wasn't standing in a corner. She was on a vast stage under a blinding spotlight. The air was thick with expectation, the velvet seats of a grand hall filled with shadowy faces. She could feel the smooth, cool ivory of a perfectly tuned piano under her fingers. She could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on her, the silent pressure of it all. A shadow passed over her face, a flicker of old fear and deep sadness. Her hand, which had been so graceful a moment before, clenched into a soft fist. She pulled it back quickly, as if the keys had burned her. She opened her eyes, and the illusion was gone. She was just an old woman in a worn cardigan, standing in a quiet, sunlit room. The reality of it washed over her, and the familiar, comforting numbness returned. She took a small step back, then another, turning away from the piano as if she had been caught doing something wrong. She smoothed down the front of her cardigan, a small, nervous gesture. She picked up her cloth and her bucket from the corner where she had left them and walked towards the kitchen. Her soft-soled shoes made no sound on the floor. The ghost in the corner had once again become invisible, a part of the background, a secret hidden in plain sight, waiting for a day when the music might finally be allowed to escape. The night of the annual fundraising talent show was the one time of year the old community center felt less like a quiet haven and more like a beehive that had been kicked. The air, usually filled with the gentle hum of quiet activity, was now thick with the smell of popcorn, nervous sweat, and the sticky sweetness of spilled soda. Every single one of the mismatched chairs was filled, and people were lining the walls, their faces lit by the colorful, slightly dizzying stage lights. A young man, barely out of his teens, was on stage trying to juggle flaming torches. He dropped one. It rolled harmlessly onto the specially protected floor, but the collective gasp from the audience was followed by a wave of supportive, pitying applause. That was the kind of night it was. A night for well-meaning attempts and gentle failures. Backstage, the organizer was having a much worse time. His name was not important. Tonight he was just a vessel of pure, unadulterated panic. He was a young man with too much enthusiasm and not nearly enough experience, and this talent show was his baby. He had poured his heart into it, designing the posters, harassing local businesses for prize donations, and creating a schedule that was timed down to the minute. Now that schedule was a smoldering ruin. In his hand, he clutched his phone, the screen still glowing with the devastating text message from the local band. "Sorry, man. Van broke down on the highway. Won't make it. 30 minutes. He had a 30-minute hole in the middle of his show, right when the energy was supposed to be building towards the finale. He could feel a cold sweat trickling down the back of his neck. He paced back and forth in the cramped space behind the stage, stepping over guitar cases and ignored props, his mind racing for a solution. He could do a longer intermission? No, people would leave. He could ask one of the earlier acts to perform again. That would just feel sad and desperate. He was trapped. His eyes darted around the main hall, scanning the crowd, the stage, the volunteers, looking for anyone who could save him. His gaze swept past the judges' table, where two figures sat looking thoroughly unimpressed. One was a stern-faced man with a salt-and-pepper beard, a music professor from the state college who had been talked into judging as a favor. The other was a woman with an impossibly straight posture and a critical eye, a former concert pianist who now wrote for the local paper. They were his experts, and they hadn't cracked a smile all night. Their presence was supposed to lend the event an air of prestige, but now they just felt like 2 centuries of judgment, witnessing his slow, public execution, and then his eyes landed on her. The old woman. She was standing by the kitchen door, holding a tray of empty paper cups, a ghost in her worn gray cardigan. She was just watching, her face a calm, neutral mask in the sea of excited and anxious faces. A memory, a tiny, insignificant fragment, sparked in his frantic mind. He remembered seeing her. Once or twice, he had seen her standing by that old, beat-up piano in the corner, her fingers hovering over the keys. She never played, but she looked at it with a certain kind of longing? He couldn't be sure. But right now, in his desperation, it was enough. It was a brilliant idea. A spontaneous, heartwarming moment. A surprise performer from the community. It was perfect. He didn't think. He just acted. He strode out from behind the stage, a wide, slightly manic smile plastered on his face. He grabbed the microphone from its stand, the feedback screeching, making a few people jump. "Wow, what a talent we have here tonight," he boomed, his voice a little too loud, a little too energetic. "But folks, we have a little surprise for you," the audience murmured, intrigued. He walked towards the kitchen, his eyes locked on the old woman. She saw him coming, and a look of confusion, then alarm, crossed her face. She tried to shrink back, to blend into the wall, but it was too late. "We have a hidden gem right here in our own community center," he announced, his voice echoing through the hall. He reached her side and gently, but firmly, took her by the elbow. Her tray of cups wobbled and fell to the floor with a soft, pathetic clatter. She flinched at the sound, her eyes wide with a terror so deep it seemed to swallow her whole. The organizer either didn't notice or didn't care. He was too caught up in his own performance. "Let's give a big, warm welcome to one of our own wonderful volunteers." He started leading her towards the stage. The audience, not knowing what else to do, began to clap. It was a polite, uncertain applause. They saw a frightened old woman being dragged into the spotlight. Some people smiled, thinking it was a cute, pre-planned skit. Others felt a pang of discomfort, a sense that something wasn't right. The professor at the judges' table raised an eyebrow and whispered something to the former pianist, who let out a small, dismissive sigh and shook her head for the old woman. The walk to the stage was a nightmare. The lights hit her like a physical blow, hot and blinding. The faces in the crowd blurred into a single, monstrous entity, 1,000 eyes all staring at her. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her legs felt like lead, each step an immense effort. She could feel the organizer's grip on her arm, not unkind but unyielding. She wanted to scream, to pull away, to run back to the safety of her quiet corner. But her voice was gone, her body frozen in a state of shock. This was her worst fear, the thing she had been running from for over 50 years, suddenly and horribly real. She was being seen. He led her up the 3 small steps onto the stage and positioned her in front of the old upright piano, the same one she touched with such reverence every day. But tonight it wasn't a quiet friend. It was an instrument of torture. "And what are you going to play for us?" the organizer asked, shoving the microphone towards her face. She just stared at him, her mouth slightly agape, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even think. The organizer chuckled, trying to cover the awkward silence. "A little shy, folks. Let's give her another hand." The applause grew a little louder, a little more encouraging. He gave her a final pat on the shoulder and then retreated backstage, leaving her alone on the stage. Alone under the lights. Alone with the piano. She stood there for a moment that stretched into an eternity, a small, gray statue of fear. The silence in the room grew heavier, thicker. The judges stared at her with open impatience. The audience watched, waiting. Slowly. As if her body were being controlled by someone else, she turned and lowered herself onto the small, wobbly bench. The wood creaked under her weight. She was facing the keyboard now, the yellowed keys seeming to mock her in the harsh light. She could feel the eyes of every single person in the room boring into her back. She was trapped. There was no escape. She was forced to play. The silence that fell over the room was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from 1,000 stares. On the small, wobbly bench, The old woman felt as though she were shrinking, her body trying to fold in on itself and disappear. The lights were no longer just hot. They were a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild, panicked rhythm that drowned out every other thought. Her hands, resting in her lap, were clenched into tight fists, her nails digging into her own palms. The piano in front of her was not the friend she visited in the quiet afternoons. It was a monster, its yellowed keys a row of teeth waiting to bite. She could feel the sweat trickling down her temples, and she was sure everyone could see it, see her fear, see her shame. She knew she had to do something. The organizer, the one who had pulled her into this nightmare, was probably watching from the wings, his own panic now matching hers. The audience was waiting. The judges were waiting. Every second that ticked by was another second of humiliation. With a monumental effort, she forced her right hand to move. It felt like it was made of lead, heavy and uncooperative. She lifted it from her lap and brought it towards the keyboard. Her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely aim. She didn't even look at the keys. She just wanted to get it over with, to produce a sound, any sound. To break the terrible silence, her index finger, still trembling, came down hard on a key in the middle of the keyboard. The note that came out was not a note at all. It was a cry. It was loud, jarring, and completely out of tune with the quiet tension of the room. It was a discordant thud of sound, ugly and naked. It hung in the air for a moment, a perfect symbol of her failure. A few people in the audience let out nervous, awkward titters of laughter. A child asked loudly, "Why did she do that?" Someone else shushed them. The sound was a small, sharp jab to her already broken spirit. At the judge's table, the reaction was swift and silent. The music professor, a man who believed in precision and discipline, let out an almost inaudible sigh of exasperation. He picked up his pen, ready to write a scathing, one-sentence review and move on. Beside him, the former pianist, a woman who had spent her life in the company of genius, didn't even bother to hide her disdain. She gave a slight, elegant shake of her head, a small, dismissive gesture that said everything. It was the look of someone who had seen 1,000 amateurs fail, and this one was no different. To them, she was just a sad old woman who had been put on stage for a cruel joke. Their judgment was a cold wind, and it chilled her to the bone. She kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed on her own hands, now resting limply on the keys. She wanted to stand up, to run away, to hide and never come out, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, trapped by the weight of their expectations and her own crushing fear. And then something strange happened. A memory, unbidden, floated up from the deep, dark well of her past. It wasn't the memory of the stage or the critical faces or the disastrous performance that had stolen her life. It was a much older memory. She was a little girl, no more than 5 years old, sitting on her mother's lap in a sun-drenched parlor. Her mother's hands, slender and graceful, were moving over a beautiful piano, playing a simple, lilting melody. It was a tune her mother had written just for her, a song about a little bird learning to fly. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell the lavender soap her mother used, feel the soft fabric of her dress, hear the gentle hum of her voice as she sang the simple words, that melody. It was a secret she had kept for over 60 years. A treasure hidden away in the darkest corner of her heart, a place she rarely dared to visit. She hadn't thought of it in years, but now it was here, clear as a bell. A flicker of something, not defiance, but perhaps a quiet sense of peace, washed over her. They had already judged her. They had already found her wanting. What more could they take? She had already lost everything. There was nothing left to fear. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her posture began to change. Her shoulders, which had been hunched around her ears, seemed to relax just a fraction. Her breathing, which had been short and sharp, deepened into a slow, steady rhythm. The frantic drumming in her chest quieted. Her left hand, which had been resting in her lap, rose and joined her right on the keyboard. Her fingers, which had been trembling with fear, now settled over the keys with a strange, familiar stillness. It was as if she were no longer in control, as if her hands remembered. What her mind had tried so hard to forget, she began to play. The first few notes were so quiet they were almost swallowed by the silence of the room. It was the same simple melody from her memory, the song her mother had written for the little bird. It was hesitant at first, like a voice long unused trying to form a word. Each note was careful, deliberate, and filled with a gentle, aching sadness. It was the sound of loneliness, of a long and quiet winter. The awkward laughter in the audience died completely. The shuffling of feet stopped. People who had been whispering to their neighbors fell silent. A hush fell over the entire hall, a deep, attentive silence that was completely different from the one before. This was a silence of listening. The professor at the judge's table froze, his pen hovering just above his clipboard. He looked up, his brow furrowed. This was not what he had expected. The simple melody was not technically complex, but there was a purity to it, an emotional honesty that was impossible to ignore. Beside him, the former pianist leaned forward slightly, her cynical expression replaced by one of intense, focused curiosity. Her head tilted to one side, her sharp ears catching every nuance of the tone, the simple tune began to grow. Her right hand continued to play the core melody, but her left hand began to weave in a harmony. It was a low, mournful counterpoint, like a shadow following the melody. The music was no longer just sad. It was telling a story. It was the story of a life filled with unspoken sorrows and quiet endurance. The music swelled, just a little, gaining confidence. Her fingers, which had seemed so old and frail a moment ago, were now moving with a quiet strength and a grace that seemed to defy her age. The song of the little bird was no longer just a memory. It was a living, breathing thing, and it was breaking the hearts of everyone who heard it. They were no longer watching a frightened old woman. They were listening to a masterpiece. The simple, sad melody continued to flow from the old piano, but it was no longer just a whisper. It was gaining strength like a small stream that has found a downhill path and is beginning to move with more purpose. The people in the audience found themselves leaning forward as if being pulled by an invisible string. The fidgeting stopped. The coughing ceased. A young mother, who had been quietly trying to entertain a restless toddler, put her hand on her child's head, and the child, sensing the shift in the room, went still and watched the stage with wide, wondering eyes. The music was weaving a spell, transforming the dusty community hall into a place of sacred listening. At the judge's table, the two experts were statues of concentration. The music professor had put down his pen. He wasn't thinking about scores or critiques anymore. His mind, a library of musical theory and history, was searching for a reference point, a composer, a piece that this reminded him of. But he found nothing. This was different. The structure was complex, yet it felt utterly natural, like a wild-growing vine instead of a carefully pruned garden. The harmony was rich and unexpected, full of chords that shouldn't work together, but did, creating a sound that was both haunting and beautiful. He found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the sound of his own breathing might break the magic. Beside him, the former pianist was having an even more profound reaction. She had spent her life surrounded by technically perfect music. She had heard the world's greatest virtuosos play on the finest instruments. But this was something else entirely. This was not about technical perfection. In fact, she could hear the slight imperfections of the untuned piano, the occasional buzz of a loose string, but none of it mattered. The music was pouring from the old woman's hands with such raw, unfiltered emotion that it bypassed the brain and went straight to the soul. It was the sound of truth. She could feel the loneliness in the low notes, the flicker of a long-lost hope in the high ones. She felt a tear well up in her eye and quickly wiped it away, annoyed at her own loss of composure. She was a judge, a critic. She was not supposed to feel. But she was feeling more deeply than she had in years. Then the music began to change again. The gentle, flowing rhythm started to quicken. The melody of the little bird, which had been so clear and simple, began to be chased by darker, more complex themes. Her left hand, which had been providing a soft, supportive harmony, was now dancing across the lower keys with a new energy and a growing sense of urgency. It was no longer a sad song. It was a story of struggle. You could hear the frustration in the sharp, staccato notes, the sound of doors closing and opportunities lost. There was a clash of melodies, a musical argument between a deep desire to create and a powerful fear of being seen. Her body began to sway with the music, a slight, almost unconscious movement. Her eyes were still closed, her face a mask of intense concentration. But it was the face of a sculptor carving a masterpiece from a block of marble. Not a frightened old woman on a stage. The young organizer watched from the wings, his mouth hanging open. The panic he had felt an hour ago had been replaced by a dumbstruck awe. He had pulled this woman onto the stage as a last-ditch effort to fill time, a cute, slightly cruel gimmick. He had expected a few clumsy notes, a moment of awkward pity, and then a quick exit. He had been so wrong. He was witnessing something he didn't have the words for. He saw the faces in the crowd, all turned towards the stage, all lit by the same soft glow of wonder. He looked at the judges, who were now completely captivated, their professional roles forgotten. He realized with a jolt that he hadn't just found a performer to fill a slot. He had accidentally uncovered a genius, and then the music exploded. It was not a sudden crash, but a building wave that finally crested and broke upon the shore of the silent hall. The simple melody was still there, at the core of it all, but it was now buried under layers of sound so rich and powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Her fingers were no longer just moving. They were flying. They were a blur of motion across the yellowed keys, striking them with a strength and speed that seemed impossible for a woman her age. The music was no longer just sad or struggling. It was a torrent of every human emotion. It was the roar of a lifetime of unshed tears, the joy of a love long remembered, the fire of a passion that had never truly died. It was a thunderous, breathtaking crescendo that filled every corner of the room. Vibrating in the chests of every person there, the professor at the judges' table had slumped forward. His elbows on the table, his head in his hands. He was not in pain. He was in a state of complete and total shock. His analytical mind had surrendered. There was no analysis to be done here, only to be experienced. The pen he had been holding lay on the floor, forgotten. The former pianist was no longer trying to hide her tears. They were now streaming freely down her face, her hand pressed to her mouth as if to stifle a sob. She was not just hearing music. She was hearing a life, a brilliant, beautiful, and tragic life being poured out in 3 minutes of sound. She, who had dedicated her life to the pursuit of musical perfection, was now in the presence of something far greater, musical truth. On the stage, the old woman was lost in a world of her own creation. She was no longer in the community hall. She was in a grand concert hall. She was in a small, lonely room. She was walking through a field of flowers. She was standing in the pouring rain. Her whole life was flashing before her, not in images, but in sound. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the torrent of music began to recede. The complex layers peeled away, one by one. The thunderous roar softened to a powerful rain, then to a gentle shower, and finally, it returned to the single, simple melody of the little bird. She played it one last time, slow and clear, and then her fingers came down on one final perfect chord. It hung in the air, shimmering and pure, a single, beautiful note that seemed to hold all the quiet and all the storm that had come before it. And then there was silence. A profound, deafening, absolute silence that was heavier and more powerful than any sound that had come before it. No one moved. No one breathed. They just sat in the wake of the masterpiece, forever changed. The silence that followed the final note was a living thing. It filled the dusty hall, pressing in on everyone, a sacred space created by the music that had just vanished. For a long moment, no one moved. The old woman's hands were still hovering over the keys, as if they were afraid the moment they left, the spell would be broken forever. Her eyes were closed, her face still a mask of intense concentration. But now a deep exhaustion was settling in, the kind that comes after a great and terrible storm. Then, a single person in the back row started to clap. It was not a polite, tentative clap. It was a single, sharp sound like a crack of thunder. Then another person joined in, and another. Within seconds, the quiet exploded. It was not just applause. It was a physical force, a tidal wave of sound that seemed to lift the very roof off the old community center. People were on their feet, their faces wet with tears they didn't even realize they were crying. They were not just clapping for a performance. They were cheering for a soul that had just laid itself bare. It was the sound of 100 hearts breaking and healing at the same time, a roar of pure, unadulterated awe. The sound finally broke through to the woman on the stage. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with a new kind of terror. It was the terror of being seen, of being truly and completely seen after a lifetime of invisibility. The wall of sound, the sea of faces, the blinding lights, it was all too much. Her body, which had been filled with the strength of the music just moments before, now felt weak and fragile. She snatched her hands back from the keys as if they were on fire and tried to stand. But her legs were shaking so badly she could barely keep her balance. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear back into the quiet corner where she belonged. But there was nowhere to go. She was trapped in the center of a hurricane of love. The young organizer, who had been watching from the wings with his mouth agape, finally snapped into action. He rushed onto the stage, not to pull her off this time, but to stand beside her, his face a mixture of shock, pride, and profound apology. He put a gentle hand on her back, and the simple, supportive gesture seemed to give her just enough strength to remain standing, but the most significant movement was coming from the judges' table. The two experts, the stern professor and the critical former pianist, were now making their way towards the stage. They moved with a sense of reverence, as if approaching a holy site. The crowd parted for them, their own applause softening to a respectful murmur. The professor, a man who had spent his life deconstructing music, now looked as if he were in the presence of something he could never hope to understand. The former pianist's face was still wet with tears, her critical mask gone forever. Replaced by an expression of pure humility, they reached the edge of the stage and looked up at her. Not as judges to a contestant, but as students to a master. The former pianist was the first to speak, her voice thick with emotion. "Ma'am," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What was that? Who composed that piece?" The old woman looked down at them, her confusion clear on her face. She just shook her head slightly, unable to find the words. "It was one of the most original and profoundly moving compositions I have ever heard," the professor added, his voice filled with a sense of wonder. "The structure, the harmonic language, it was genius. Absolute genius." Hearing these words she had dreamed of hearing as a young woman but never thought she would, seemed to unlock something inside her. The fear in her eyes was slowly replaced by a deep, weary sadness. She looked out at the sea of faces, all staring at her with such kindness. And for the first time in over 50 years, she felt she could tell the story. She began to talk. Her voice at first a rusty whisper, but it grew stronger as she spoke. She told them about being a little girl, a child prodigy whose fingers could fly across the keys before she could properly write her own name. She spoke of a teacher with a cold smile and a heart of stone, a man who told her that music was not about feeling, but about perfection, that one single mistake in a performance would ruin her forever. She described the night of her big debut in a grand hall much larger than this community center. She told them how she had walked out onto the stage, her heart pounding with the teacher's voice echoing in her ears, and how her mind had simply gone blank. Her fingers, which had always been her friends, had frozen on the keys, refusing to move. She spoke of the silence that had followed, a silence much like this one, but filled not with awe, but with pity and disappointment. She had run from the stage that night and never looked back. She had hidden her talent away, locking it in a deep, dark place because it had brought her more pain than joy. She had come to this community center to be invisible, and the old piano in the corner was the only piece of her past she couldn't bear to leave behind. In the days that followed, her life changed in ways she could never have imagined. The video of her performance, recorded on a dozen phones in the audience that night, went viral. It was shared millions of times, with headlines like "The Ghost of Willow Creek" and "The Genius Who Hid for 50 Years." Reporters and television crews from all over the world descended on the small town, wanting to interview the mysterious musical genius. Offers for recording contracts, concert tours, and appearances on national shows poured in. The world wanted to make her a star, but she refused them all. The thought of stepping onto another grand stage, of being put on display, still terrified her. The fame and fortune meant nothing to her. The only thing that mattered was the quiet peace she had found, not in the roaring applause, but in the telling of her story. The money raised from the now infamous talent show, which had been a record-breaking amount, was presented to her. But she had a different idea for it. She sat down with the young organizer, who now looked at her with a deep and abiding respect, and told him what she wanted. She didn't want the money for herself. She wanted to use it to renovate the old community hall, and she wanted to turn a small, unused storage room at the back of the building into a proper music studio. A few months later, the studio was ready. It was a bright, cheerful room with a new, beautifully tuned piano, soundproofed walls, and comfortable chairs. And there, sitting on the bench, was the old woman. She was no longer the unnoticed volunteer in the corner. She was a teacher. A small, nervous child was sitting beside her, and she was gently guiding the child's fingers to the correct keys. She was not teaching the child to be a prodigy or to fear mistakes. She was teaching the child to feel the joy of making a sound, to create a simple melody, to find their own voice in the music. Her own silence was finally broken not by a thunderous crescendo for the world, but by the quiet, beautiful sound of a new song beginning. She was home.